Good evening, folks, and welcome to the public webinar for the Southeast Region Coastal Species of Concern Predation Management Plan and Programmatic Environmental Assessment. I'm Kelly Daigle. I'm the project manager, and thank you for joining us. I know it's evening out on the East Coast, so we appreciate you attending, and we look forward to your questions at the end of the session. Today, we'll start by introducing our park staff on the line, followed by a presentation to help you learn about the plan and the programmatic EA process. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions of NPS staff. We have a robust group of folks on the line today, ready and willing to answer any questions you might have about this project and our process. So let's start with some introductions. For the park representatives on the line, if you wouldn't mind, please let us know your name, what park unit you represent, and also your area of expertise. So let's start with Cape Hatteras National Seashore.
Thank you, Kelly. This is Dave Halleck. I'm the superintendent of Cape Hatteras National Seashore, and I have a background in wildlife and fisheries biology, but my primary responsibility right now is overall management of the park.
Hi, Kelly. This is Sabrina Henry. I'm the Environmental Protection Specialist for Cape Hatteras National Seashore.
Mike Barber, Public Affairs Specialist for Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have folks on from Gulf Island National Seashore? Okay, how about Cumberland Island?
Hi, Kelly. This is Doug Hoffman. I'm the wildlife biologist for Cumberland Island. Background is 30 plus years of wildlife management and most specifically predation management to threatened and endangered species in the Southeast.
Thanks, Doug. How about Canaveral National Seashore?
Good evening. This is Kristen Kneifel from Canaveral National Seashore. I'm the Chief of Natural and Cultural Resources here at the park, and my expertise is basically wildlife management. Been working with sea turtles and shorebirds and things for about the past 20 years.
Thanks, Kristen. I believe we've got some folks on from the Southeast Regional Office. Jamie or Anna?
Yeah, this is Anna Colleen. I'm the marine scientist for the Southeast Regional Office in the Division of Science and Natural Resource Management.
And Jamie Hammond, I'm the Regional Environmental Coordinator for the Southeast Region, which is essentially, I've been doing NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act work for over 20 years.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Anna. How about from the Biological Resources Division for the Washington Support Office?
Hi, my name's Dave Trevino. I work as a wildlife biologist for the Biological Resources Division, which is a Washington Support Office. And I manage the avian program for the Biological Resource Division.
Thanks, Dave. And we've also got a representative from EMPSI, our contractor.
Hello, this is Meredith Sicario and Lindsay Chipman, and we are both biologists and have been helping with the plan.
Thanks, Meredith. Okay, so before handing things over to Jamie Hammond, our Regional Environmental Coordinator for the presentation, there are just a few logistical items I want to let you guys know about before we begin. So as an attendee during this presentation, your phone and voice over IP lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have questions about the presentation or any other information we've made available, you can type this into the questions area on your GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to type in your question at any time during the webinar, and we will get to it after the presentation. We'll do our best to respond to all the questions once the presentation is finished, time permitting. I wanted to make note that comments and questions submitted as part of this webinar will not be considered formal comments on the plan. If you have comments that you'd like to share after listening in today, you'll be able to do so via the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. We also refer to this as PEPC, or by mail, and we will have information available at the end of the presentation on both of these ways to submit comments. And I'll also chat out or text out the link to PEPC here shortly. The deadline to submit your comments is October 26, 2018. And again, we'll provide additional details on how to submit your comments later in our presentation. We'll also post a recording of this webinar at the web address on your screen. So if folks in your office or folks you know that are interested in this topic can't join us, you'll be able to direct them to that website and view this recording both today as well as Thursday's recording. So at this time, I'd like to hand it over to Jamie Hammond, our Regional Environmental Coordinator, for the presentation.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Hi, good afternoon. Again, thank you all for taking the time to participate in our webinar today. Information that will be presented can all be found in the Programmatic Environmental Assessment, but we wanted to provide a snapshot of the information and really give you all an opportunity to ask questions with, with the experts that we have at hand. Before I begin, I'd just like to mention it is government, so of course we have acronyms, and for the most part we will avoid acronyms, but two that might be used would be NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, and an EA or PEA for the Programmatic Environmental Assessment. I'd like to first start with the background of the plan. The predation management tools and methods evaluated in the Programmatic EA were developed based on depredation issues specific to coastal park units in the Southeast region. So any decision resulting from the Programmatic EA process would cover all Southeast region park units where there's a need to protect coastal species of concern. A park unit would not implement the actions identified in the Programmatic EA unless it determined that there is a need to take action to protect coastal species of concern from depredation. And before we go any further, I want to provide the definition of species of concern that's in the plan, which are those species in need of conservation actions based on their rarity, declining population trends, or susceptibility to threats. These species may be included on state or federal lists of threatened or endangered species, or they may be protected by other laws or regulations, such as Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I also want to make it clear that our base understanding is that predators are an important and necessary function of healthy ecosystems. However, predation can have devastating effects on coastal species of concern, such as protected sea turtles, shorebirds, and beach mice that are already stressed by other environmental factors, such as habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. Okay, next slide. So once it was clear there was an issue with predators across our eastern coastal parks, we discussed these issues with those parks, in particular those that were most affected. And the scope of the plan was determined based on input from those park units regarding depredation of coastal species of concern, which again includes both federally listed threatened and endangered species and state listed species. We found that some of our coastal parks were in need of a strategy to better protect these species. And the benefit of this programmatic environmental assessment is that it's a consolidated effort which can be used across the National Park Service Southeast region to facilitate and streamline planning, interagency coordination, and program management for the protection and recovery of these coastal species of concern. Next slide. Based on input from those coastal parks and other NPS experts, and also upon public scoping discussions, we determined that this plan would focus on the coastal species of concern that you see on the slide in front of you, specifically species of sea turtles, various species of shorebirds, and beach mice. An individual park might have a need to add a species to this list at some point, and they'd be able to do so in their individual implementation and site-specific analysis that would tier to this plan. So they would add that species and analysis specific to that species. Next slide. So as with coastal species of concern, based on input from our coastal parks and other National Park Service experts, and also from public scoping input, we determined that this plan would focus on the coastal predator species that you see on the slide in front of you. These species have been found to have an impact on species of concern at our coastal parks. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, while we feel we've been really thorough, an individual park might have a need to add a species to the list and would be able to do so in their individual implementation and site-specific analysis. And I think it bears repeating that the National Park Service recognizes that while predation is a natural process, Coastal species of concern are often already at very low population numbers, and predation management can be used to help achieve species or ecosystem management objectives, including the recovery of federally listed species. Next. So we determined the best way to approach this issue was with this programmatic effort. In this case, the term programmatic describes that we're taking this broad or high-level approach to this National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, review. And while many NEPA documents, and when I refer to NEPA documents, categorical exclusion, environmental assessment, environmental impact statement, that you might be familiar with might focus on site-specific or park-specific projects. Federal agencies can also prepare these programmatic NEPA documents to assess potential impacts from policies, programs, and plans. So these types of documents are inherently broad in scope, since they typically could affect a larger geographic area compared with a more site-specific project. And in our case, the programmatic EA will be applicable to all coastal parks in the Southeast region, where coastal species of concern included in this plan are present. It focuses on species, tools, and methods, but it does not focus on individual parks, although individual parks are used in our impact analysis. The programmatic EA is expected to provide significant utility for any park where the species of concern addressed in the programmatic EA are present. An advantage of this programmatic NEPA review in this case is that it will result in a decision regarding which tools and methods will be used in the Southeast Region park units out of this sort of toolbox approach provided in the programmatic document. And the programmatic effort contains impact analysis for the tools and methods, which could then be incorporated into a park's own site-specific NEPA review. And that's what's referred to as tiering. And so these tiered park-specific NEPA reviews would address where and when each park would use the tools and methods included in the selected action from the programmatic EA. They would not need to revisit what tools can or should be used to control predators in the park-specific EAs. They would also include park-specific compliance with other laws and requirements as needed, such as Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, tribal consultation, and others. And depending on the actions that the park would take, they might tier to this environmental assessment with a categorical exclusion or potentially another environmental assessment depending on the actions that they're proposing. Okay, next. So once it was clear there was a need to develop a regional approach to the protection of these coastal species of concern, we needed to first determine what actions were currently ongoing in individual parks, and then look at potential alternatives. You'll notice there are certainly similarities between the alternatives. However, under the no action alternative, parks currently using predation management to protect these coastal species of concern would continue to control predators threatening these species on a case-by-case basis, following park unit-specific guidance and need, and there would not be a consolidated or consistent effort across the region. The predation management tools and methods that are currently used and those that are proposed are generally used to deter or remove individual predators, taking into account the effectiveness and humaneness of the tool or method in controlling the target predator species. Currently, park units are responsible for completing all NEPA compliance and consultation requirements for predation management for their individual park, and this has led to inconsistent compliance approaches across the region. Okay. This slide identifies the current list of predation control tools and methods that would continue to be used on a case-by-case basis under the no action alternative. In the next slides, I'll identify the primary differences between these methods and those proposed under the action alternative. But as I mentioned earlier, many of the tools and methods are also included in the proposed action. Okay, next. Under the proposed action, or alternative B, all park units in the National Park Service Southeast region would have a suite of tools and methods or toolbox available to control predators threatening coastal species of concern, including tools and methods that were not previously used by some park units in the region. The proposed action would streamline the approach for predation management by providing programmatic NEPA compliance across the region to cover all Southeast coastal region parks with these species, resulting in the timely and efficient implementation of the tools and methods presented. The predation management tools and methods that would be available to parks would be similar to those used by various parks under the no action alternative. Although all Southeast coastal parks would have the opportunity to use the entire toolbox, and under Alternative B, they'd have additional tools such as tools to manage avian predators and ghost crabs, which were not currently being implemented. Next. So as I mentioned earlier, implementation of the proposed action would establish this framework for the use of predation management tools and methods, while park unit-specific depredation efforts would be proposed and evaluated in these tiered NEPA reviews. The use of tiering would eliminate the need for repetitive discussion. So these tiered documents would not go back and evaluate those tools and methods from the programmatic EA. It's simply focus on the park site-specific issues, identify which of those tools and methods might be appropriate for their park. In this way, the programmatic approach sort of expedites the resolution of the broader scale issues so that subsequent analysis can focus on park-specific impacts and issues. Tiering also allows the site-specific NEPA compliance to be conducted closer in time to the actual implementation of predation management tools and methods, so that all details specific to each action or project can be considered as appropriate. Predation management under the proposed action would be selective to reduce the likelihood of adverse impacts associated with various predation management tools and methods. And after identifying target predators, park staff would use the most effective and humane tools and methods available to deter or remove predators. The National Park Service would also apply regionally consistent best management practices and mitigation measures to reduce the likelihood of adverse impacts associated with the predation management. Next. When evaluating impacts on predator species, we looked at the type of impact. For instance, in the slide that you see in front of you, we used the example of screening or fencing and looked at the type of impact, which is the impact of reducing the predator's ability to access habitat that would be screened or fenced. We looked at the extent of the impact, which in that example, the extent was in terms of acres of habitat. We looked at how long the impact would last, which in terms of screening or fencing, it would last through the nesting season for that species. And we looked at the magnitude of the impact in the context, in context. Would the impact be a small impact or a large impact to the species? And all of this is in the programmatic environmental assessment. So on the next two slides, you'll see the direct impact to predator species from the use of lethal tools and methods presented in the table. This table shows the estimated current removal of predators at 4 park units under the no action alternative or alternative A. And the next slide will show the estimated removal of predators at 10 park units under the proposed action, which is alternative B. You'll notice for this alternative that the total removal of predator species by the National Park Service at Southeast coastal park units represents less than 1% of the total removal of those species taken by hunters or trappers in states where hunting is permitted. And then the next table, when looking at the total removal of species under the proposed action or alternative B, it would increase as compared to the no action alternative because we estimate up to 10 park units may lethally remove predators. A selective removal of these predators from National Park Service Southeastern coastal park units is still not a significant impact and represents 2% or less of the total removal of those species from hunters and trappers in states where this is permitted. Where there are larger changes expected under this alternative, for example, mink or ghost crab, the National Park Service would monitor these species, and in the event there's any meaningful decrease in local populations, the National Park Service would stop lethal management and would allow those local populations to recover. Next. The impacts to coastal species of concern would be mostly beneficial in that there would be decreased depredation, an increase in reproductive success, and an increase in habitat availability and use. So as an example of this beneficial effect, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conservatively estimates that in areas where predators are selectively removed, as they would be, the long-term average productivity of shorebird coastal species of concern could increase by 20%. Okay, next. So although the effects to coastal species of concern is expected to be mostly beneficial, we did consider the adverse effects to species from implementation of non-lethal and lethal tools as well. And the stepwise consideration of effects was exactly the same as was applied to predator species, including looking at the type of impact, the extent, the duration, and magnitude. And adverse effects were very small. They were localized and minor, and would not adversely affect coastal species of concern in a meaningful way. So for a quick comparison of alternatives, under the no action alternative, parks would continue their current efforts, which would be inconsistent in terms of application tools, best management practices, and compliance. And under the proposed action, parks would be given additional tools and methods to protect species of concern. There'd be consistent effort at applying the tools and best management practices, compliance, and therefore more measurable impacts. And overall actions proposed under the proposed action would facilitate and streamline planning, interagency coordination, and program management for the protection and recovery of these species. And also some tools would actually be removed and not implemented under this action, including the use of effigies, conditioned taste aversion, biological odor repellents, disruptive harassment, and frightening devices. Okay. So you can see where we are in the process with the programmatic document now out on review. And this week, our public webinars, our next step will be to analyze any public comments and refine the programmatic environmental assessment. I will address and respond to all substantive comments by this winter and would intend to prepare a finding of no significant impact, which is the decision document, by this winter. Next. So as a quick reminder, we will not be accepting comments on this webinar. So if you have comments you'd like to share after listening in today, you will be able to do so electronically at the link listed on this slide or by mailing in your comment to the address listed here. So please send comments no later than October 26th of 2018 prior to developing and signing the decision document or the FONSI that I mentioned earlier, finding of no significant impact. We would review every comment submitted during open comment period and prepare responses to substantive comments. Any responses to substantive comments would be appended to that decision document and would be made available to the public. And just as a definition, substantive comments are defined as those that question with a reasonable basis the accuracy of information in the EA, the adequacy of the analysis, those that present reasonable alternatives other than those presented in the EA, or cause changes or revisions to the management actions proposed in the alternatives. So as a guide, when considering what to include in your public comment, a few suggestions to make your comment really useful to the planning process would be that, comment is not a form of voting for an alternative. So it's really more helpful to provide comments that are clear, concise, and relevant to the issues at hand. Providing as much detail as possible in your comments is helpful, and relating them back specifically to the programmatic environmental assessment. That'll ensure that your comments are understood and that we fully address your comments in our responses. Okay. So
Great.
we're at the conclusion. Go ahead,
Jamie.
Kelly.
Sorry.
I was just going to say we're at the conclusion. So thank everybody for sitting in and listening in, and I'll just turn it back over to you, Kelly, for Q&A.
Thanks, Jamie. Sorry, I jumped in there a little early. As Jamie mentioned, we'll turn our attention to questions and answers. Your lines will continue to be muted, so please use that questions or chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel to communicate with us. We'd love to hear from you. And as Jamie mentioned, this is an opportunity to ask questions. So any comments submitted through this webinar will not be considered formal comments on the plan. If you wish to submit comments, please do so using one of those methods described in the presentation, and I can pull back up that slide so you've got that information there. We do have one question that we'll start with and give other folks a chance to type in their questions. And I can handle this one because it's mostly about the NEPA process. But this question is, why is the NPS proposing a programmatic approach versus a park-specific or unit-specific approach? We thought about different NEPA pathways as we launched into this process, and an advantage of a programmatic NEPA review in this case is that it will result in a decision regarding which tools and methods will be used in the Southeast region parks. And this document will contain an impact analysis for those tools and methods, which can then be incorporated into those park-specific NEPA reviews. Park units will be able to complete those NEPA reviews. That could be a CE or an EA that tier off of the analysis conducted in this programmatic document. That park-specific NEPA compliance would address really the specifics at the park unit level, the where and the when that each of these tools would be used. But the park units would not have to revisit what tools can or should be used to control predators, in the park-specific review. Additionally, park units would then complete specific compliance with other laws, such as the National Historic Preservation Act. Okay, we've got another question in here that says, will poisons be used to eradicate predators? This is a great question. I wonder if Doug might be able to fill us in on the use and types of poisons we have considered under the plan.
Yes, I can do that, Kelly. Based on the proposed alternative B, the only toxicant that the Park Service would consider is an avian toxicant that is called DRC 1339. It is a very species-specific toxicant that can be basically formulated for the bird species you're trying to control. And in this case, it would be American crows or fish crows. The benefit of this particular chemical is that the mixture that you would use for the crow to eliminate him is not toxicant to any other bird species. Plus, you don't have a secondary toxicity level associated with that. So, for example, if a crow was to eat that toxicant and then pass in the 24-hour period after he eats it, if another animal eats that crow, then there's no hazard to that animal by eating the crow that has been eradicated with that toxicant. As far as any mammalian predators, we have no proposal to use toxicants for mammalian predators.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, I've got another question here that comes up kind of frequently, so I thought we'd address it. And Jamie, this might be a good question for you. Is the programmatic plan intended to include all park units in the Southeast region?
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer that. So the programmatic plan is applicable to all coastal parks in our Southeast region, specifically where the species of concern are present. But, if a park determines, that they don't need to take action for whatever reason, then they would not be required to. So once a park, determines that there is a need to take action to protect coastal species of concern, then they would be able to take action once they do that tiered document that I mentioned earlier. So the plan addresses species of concern that are common to, all of our coastal areas in the Southeast region. And if the park has, some or all of the conditions that are covered in our plan, then they'll be able to tier off of our EA with this programmatic EA with a park-specific NEPA document, should they choose to do so. So if, and I mentioned this a little bit in the presentation, but, if additional information is needed that's relevant specifically to their park, they would apply that information in that tiered document. And that could be, it would be, information that's specific for maybe location specific for their park, or it might be that, they would identify the tools, they would identify the methods, they would identify the species, and if there was an additional species they needed to consider, then they would include that in their tiered document. So a park unit would only be required to use it if they choose to use it.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Well, it looks like that's the end of our questions at this time. What I would offer is we'll stick around for a couple more minutes, maybe let folks gather their thoughts, ask any other additional questions. While you're thinking about it, I would also point out we have another public webinar on Thursday. This is October 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you have folks that couldn't join tonight or interested in learning more about the project, The link to register for that webinar is on that same website, parkplanning.nps.gov/FERO. So we would encourage you guys to register, join us. We'll be giving the same presentation and then also offering another Q&A session. So with that being said, we've got another question here. Our question is, how would NPS control ghost crabs? I would offer this either up to Cape Hatteras or Doug as well. I think both park units, Cumberland Island and Cape Hatteras, have had some experience or interest in managing ghost crabs. Would either one of you want to answer this question?
Kelly, this is Sabrina at Cape Hatteras. We're going to actually refer to Doug if that'd be okay, just as a wildlife biologist.
Sure thing.
Okay. Typically, you're dealing with isolated situations with ghost crabs. Could be at a particular sea turtle nest where a crab has located the egg chamber and is continuing to depredate, one egg after another for several days. You can have a nearly complete nest loss to 100 to 150 eggs out of a sea turtle nest. So you're really only trying to capture and eliminate, in that situation, just one or two ghost crabs at a specific site. Another situation you might deal with is a colony of shorebirds that are nesting possibly over several acres of land, where you would have obviously multiple ghost crabs using that acreage, and you would want to try to significantly reduce that population of ghost crabs or eliminate them from that small area while the birds are nesting, because they can not only take eggs while the birds are sitting on eggs, but they can also take newly hatched chicks. So that would be capture and lethal removal using proven trap methods for ghost crabs. Typically, the overall percentage of the population of crabs you would take from a beach would be fairly insignificant based on observations that we've all made, on our beaches day and night. You could have several hundred or several thousand ghost crabs using a long stretch of beach, and you might only remove anywhere from 2 to, say, 100 ghost crabs in a situation per summer.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, we'll hang out for a couple more minutes, see if any other questions come in. If you don't have any other questions, I'll say thanks for joining, and please submit any comments on the plan at our park website so we can ensure your comments are thoughtfully incorporated into our final decision document.
Kelly, could I add something to that earlier question on the toxicant use for avian species?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Just having some more time to give it some thought. The use of avian toxicants in our situation is really expected to be limited to just maybe 1 or 2 park units, again, on an isolated situation where you have possibly 1 to a dozen crows that have learned to predate shorebird nests. So we're not going to be just randomly placing toxicants out for crows. We're going to evaluate a situation where we have known damage from a group of crows, local crows, and then we're going to try to respond to that initially by non-lethal techniques. And then if that does not work, then we're going to try to remove those offending crows, which is a really insignificant portion of that local population of birds in a general area.
Great. Thanks for that clarification, Doug.
Kelly, can I also add something? This is David, Cape Hatteras, and it's just a general comment related to the comment you're asking, using the word eradicate. And please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think anything in this plan is related to eradication of any particular wildlife species. This programmatic EA is centered around strategic control of predator species that are affecting rare or protected shorebirds or other species of wildlife. It is possible that some parks, including Cape Hatteras, may have goals to eradicate non-native species, but that's not what's described in this particular plan. This is about strategic control.
Yeah, great clarification, Dave. Thank you. All right, well, seeing no other further questions, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of the folks from the field, from each of the park units, as well as the region and our WASO staff for joining. Thanks everybody to attending, and please submit your comments. We'd love to hear from you. The link to submit those comments is up on the screen, and we'll post this recording in addition to the one on Thursday at that link as soon as we can. So with that, I'll say have a great evening, and we will chat with everybody shortly. Thanks.